welcome on this webinar on transforming OT cybersecurity by NCC Group together with our colleagues from Splunk. We'll start off by introducing ourselves. My name is Floris. I'm a product manager at NCC Group. I've been at NCC Group and the subsidiary Fox IT for 3 years. I have a background in IT audit and control, and over the past several years, besides my responsibilities as product manager for the managed services with Splunk, I've been involved with expanding our monitoring service towards OT, and those two elements come together today. So over to Ewald.
Yeah, thank you, Floris. So my name is Ewald from Splunk Cisco. I look after the manufacturing vertical in Europe. I'm with the Splunk since 6.5 years, and obviously OT security plays a key role. Yeah, and lastly, I'm based in Stuttgart in Germany. Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Ewald. Jamie McCallion. I'm a partner technical manager with security strategy responsibility across all of EMEA now. I've been around the Splunk universe around 15 years and working in security for the last 10. Working on OT security things here and there over the last sort of 5 or 6 years as well. So that's me. Back to you, Floris.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Ewald. So today, sort of the high-level program for today is that we'll start off by giving a small introduction to the problem and how that materializes in practice. Then we move on to why network monitoring is so important and why OT monitoring starts at the network. And subsequently, we move over to the role of Splunk and using a SIEM together with that network monitoring. We're going to start off with a small example, a small introduction, a small scenario. And we're going to talk about an NCC client in the oil trading sector. And this is a client, and they had several of these really large silos in ports all across Europe. And they had independent control networks per site. So each and every site you had completely separate control networks. And they did all kinds of things from tank control, from pump control to loading management systems. There was some remote vendor access in place. This was for maintenance purposes, and that often happened via unmanaged VPN. They did have SOC monitoring, but the SOC monitored their IT estate only, and they were using Splunk for that. And at some point, they were considering, hey, there might be a NIS2 audit coming up. So we should probably do something here. And that preparation flagged the lack of OT monitoring and a lack of possibility of correlating incidents across the IT and OT estates. Just to paint why that's important, if there was a single hour of downtime at this client, if for some reason they would have to shut down their OT estate completely, that could incur upwards of 100,000 euros in either contractual penalties or trading losses because they were trading with these vats of oil. And we have seen in the past, and there are plenty of examples of that even if the incident didn't necessarily occur in OT, even if it was an IT incident, that might still mean that you would have to shut down your OT, even as a prevention measure. For example, that happened with the Colonial Pipeline incident in the US a couple of years ago. So it's quite serious, and it has direct business impact if something like this would happen, especially if proper segmentation is not in place, because then lateral movement becomes quite easy and OT incidents can cascade. And for that specific reason, regulators, of course, are now also on top of this. In Europe, the NIS2 directive and the local variants of that do demand that you are in control of your risks, that you do know what the assets are in your OT estate as well as in your IT estate, that you then subsequently say, okay, these assets, they come with these specific risks, and these are the mitigations that we have formulated there. So in this specific case, luckily client leadership recognized that, and they contacted us. And what we did in this specific case was that we made a couple of criticality assessments. So we went in and we said, okay, maybe this specific part of your estate can be done for a couple of days, that won't have any material impact. But this part, it can only be done for a couple of minutes. So this is where you really need to have good monitoring, good response capabilities, besides just what you're doing from a prevention perspective. So what we did in addition to the IT monitoring that was already in place, we started implementing NDR sensors. A little bit more about what NDR sensors are later on, but effectively they are a passive sensor listening to your network traffic and relaying that information back to the central location. We integrated the output of those NDR alerts, the NDR sensors, into Splunk. And in Splunk, we were able to correlate the output from the NDR with firewall logs, with process alarms, with customized threat intel. And by iteratively building out that capability across the different sites that they had, we're able to get some results pretty fast in several weeks. And the client was left with, on their end, centralized OT visibility. They had an understanding of what was happening in their environment. They were able to add additional rules that allowed them to have early detection of misconfiguration, because while incidents occurring, real incidents from a threat actor perspective occurring in OT are relatively rare, especially as they originate in OT. A really dangerous thing can happen with misconfiguration, like leaving ports open, like keeping default credentials in, or even on the PLC level, just plainly the wrong credentials for, plainly the wrong settings for a specific PLC purpose. And that allowed a large reduction in mean time to detect, just because you were monitoring the network and not just firewall logs or simple alarms. You were able to see threats and potential misconfigurations quite a bit earlier. So moving from this example to the problem, why are we even talking about this? I have some slides here that are in black and white, and they're in black and white because they are from a pretty old document. These are from an American research piece back in 1997 from the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure. And what they flagged for, as far as I could learn, one of the first times is, okay, this was at the end of the 90s, we now have the internet. And unlike in the past, we have the internet connecting industrial sites, and not just connecting the industrial sites among each other, but also connecting that to the public internet. And that introduces a lot of vulnerabilities. And essentially, that core problem, the fact that we have gained a lot of convenience, the ability to remotely patch, the ability to remotely assess what's happening at a certain manufacturing site or at a OT site, that introduces risk, of course, as well, because if you can come in to change settings, then you can also come in with malicious intent. And if you can get data out, then you might have a confidentiality issue. So that core problem has compounded over the past few decades, and it has moved beyond the idea of a theoretical problem into a realistic problem, where we've actually seen incidents over the past decades, starting with Stuxnet, of course, 50 years ago now, moving on to all the attacks on the Ukrainian power grid, and now that the geopolitical landscape has perhaps shifted a little bit, we can see this increasing in size. So from that type of threat actor perspective, that's definitely happening. And then there are ransomware attacks in OT. And I think Ewald will be mentioning a figure there as well. But we have seen over the past few years that it kept increasing year upon year, ransomware attacks in OT. So you need to do something about it. There is a clear business problem it has impact on finance, and it has impact on security. So the need is clear. So zooming out a little bit, what are we talking about? I've already kind of voiced this over and sort of set the scene, but just from a diagram perspective, it's helpful to give a few anchor points. And essentially, each and every IT environment with an OT component can be abstracted in this way. It's often much more complex if you look at details, but this is the high-level abstraction. There is the public internet with all the threats occurring. Then there is typically a firewall separating the bad outside world from the inside to the office IT. And then there is a firewall separating the office IT from the operational technology segments. And that means that threats can occur in one of three ways on a high level. There are the threats coming in from the outside, threats from the public internet, and they are by far the most numerous. This might be a phishing email that gives an attacker initial access, that then allows the attacker to plant malware onto the office IT, and that will then cascade on, and from there on propagate throughout the kill chain. But you also have attacks that originate in OT, and while rarer, of course, that means that you are immediately in the heart of the problem. So that might come from an insider attack, insider threats. That might be either deliberate or it might be accidental. Somebody might come in for maintenance purposes and bring in a 4G modem, not necessarily overseeing all the consequences of that. And then there might be third-party or supply chain threats. You might have perfect control of your own site, but if one of your suppliers switches their own supplier, do you necessarily know? And what does that mean for your security posture? So there are a couple of points where we can see threats coming in. So there are also a couple of points where we need to defend. And that's why we are starting off with the network. Because, well, a couple of things first. Before we start talking about detection, which is going to be the main body of what we're going to talk about today, we'll first talk about prevention. Because all that we're going to talk about in the rest of the webinar hinges on a couple of assumptions, on a couple of preconditions. And the first assumption is physical security. For now, we'll assume that physical security is good, because if you don't control who gets in your site, who has actual physical access to your ports, to your routers, to switches, who can come in with a USB stick, then essentially all bets are off. So from a prevention perspective, we want to get that sorted first, and only then we can really start talking about proper monitoring. So we'll assume that as a given going forward. Now, besides a physical prevention layer, you need a defensible architecture. So it needs, on an abstract level, at least resemble the picture that we had earlier with, the bad outside world, then an enterprise or office IT zone, then a industrial firewall or an industrial DMZ, and only then will you have the OT segments, the control zone and the safety zone. If you don't have that, if there are no firewalls in between, then that's the thing you should fix first. Sense has a great white paper on this and a couple of rules of thumb that you can use. So for now, we're at a point where we assume that all the preconditions are set. What can you then do to monitor your network? Well, we've just said, okay, we'll assume it's physically secure. So then the thing that we need to monitor are the connections in between. And that's through the network. So an IT network can be monitored in a number of different ways. You can have your EDRs, your endpoint detection and response tooling. You can have a SIEM looking at logs, and you can have a network sensor. You might even have honeypots in there that you monitor, or You might have all kinds of identity monitoring tools, and that's all well and good. And there are lots of things that you can do in IT. OT, in that sense, is a bit more constrained and also a bit more simple. In OT, we often have lots of legacy devices, so often very old PLCs, very sensitive constellations of machines that are vulnerable to disruption. So one of the last things that you would want to do in an OT environment is install all kinds of software that might not even be able to be installed on PLCs or on very old Windows and Linux versions. But certainly, even if you might be able to install them, they might cause disruption to your network. So what we typically would advise in OT is to start with passive monitoring. And that's where the NDR comes in, where the network sensor comes in. So what you would effectively do here is start with a tap or a span port. So you would listen passively to a tap and then see all the telemetry coming in. From there on, you would apply different types of detection logic. So you could use your basic if this then that detection logic, for example, Suricata, your signature-based detection logic, or you would apply machine learning models. And that's very powerful, especially in OT. What it will allow you to do is say, okay, we have a certain baseline, and if something happens afterward that was not present during the baseline, you will flag it. That's an anomaly, and that creates an alert that you would then send on to the SOC or to whoever's monitoring that. Example would be in the realm of PLCs, in the realms of, for example, S7COM, a Siemens protocol. You would have a read opcodes and write opcodes. Now, a read opcode is relatively normal in a 7COM. That's what's happening during normal operations. But the moment you see a write opcode, then something is changing. So typically, during a baselining period, if there's no maintenance, if there are no changes to the operation, then you wouldn't see that write opcode. But if you were suddenly seeing it post-baselining, then that could create an alert. And for these purposes, we use our own network sensors in NCC Group, but potentially each and every passive network sensor on a high level employs the same techniques. So you are monitoring the network, you're applying detection logic to it, either signature-based or anomaly-based or both. And from there on, you create alerting that you can then also correlate with potentially other sources. And then the question is, where in the Purview model does that fit? So this is the Purview model. For those of you that are very familiar with OT, you will know this model. It's one of the most commonly used models in OT. And this is yet another view of the abstract slide we had at the beginning, where we separate the office IT from the OT. And here we can see layer 3.5. That's your office IT, that's your industrial DMZ, and everything above that is the office IT, and everything below that is the proper OT. And what we essentially suggest as NCC Group, and I found to my great happiness that Splunk agrees with us on that, is you need it essentially everywhere. The best thing you can do is monitor what's coming from the outside in, what's going from the inside out, and what's happening in between. So what we typically suggest is put a network sensor monitoring your enterprise network, put a network sensor in monitoring your lower layers of OT, and make sure that there is a network sensor that can see the traffic moving across the industrial DMZ. And then make sure that all the alerting from those network sensors comes to a central location, in a SIEM, for example, potentially in Splunk. So we can make that correlation across IT and OT. But the network sensor is not the entire story. And monitoring the network is not the entire story. And why exactly that is will now be addressed by Jamie. Over to you, Jamie.
I think you've set the scene really well there. So if we take a next step forward and think about what our environments really look like, then they're really, really complicated, right? We haven't just got that perfect separation. We might have it logically, but the physical complexity of the environment, it's everywhere. We will have different network segments, different technologies everywhere. We need to be able to bring all of that together and correlate the different things that happen at different times to work out what's happened fundamentally. So we get all of this signal coming from the OT network and from the network detection. But what about everything else that's happened at the same time? Floris said there about read events versus write events. So when did the write event occur? If that's the thing that we're trying to trigger against, what machine sent it? Which user was logged in at the time that happened? Those are the sorts of bits of complexity that we're starting to try to unpick, because across that fabric there could be people everywhere and there could be bad things happening in all sorts of places. So if we think about some common sorts of actors, I've simplified the network again here. So we've got cloud security on the edge. We've got some kind of control system. We've got some malware being deployed inside the network. We've got a network to be able to bridge out to the control device to then talk into our automation environment. We may have somebody using compromised credentials to be able to penetrate straight all the way through onto that control system. We might have somebody dropping some phishing and some malware in there as well that then hunts across the network and goes searching and replicating itself. So given that complexity and given all of the network signal, then we need to know these other dimensions too. So who and what, as well as where, is really, really important to be able to work out what's happening. If we can collect that signal from everywhere and bring it all into one place, then we can start to visualize what happened and we can start to correlate it. We can also start to enrich at that point as well. So if we just start to join these bits and pieces together and say we saw this on the firewall, we saw this on the secure network, we saw these other things from these other data sources like Active Directory or from our storage servers, or maybe from our containerized environments as well as seeing something happening in our OT environment. We can maybe start to piece together what's happening and what's happened, and work out not only where our control points need to be in the OT estate, but also in the IT estate that may be being used as a route to get somewhere. We may all be used to talking about things like zero trust networking and secure access and secure edge. That becomes really important when we start thinking about these sorts of networks where the physical infrastructure may be physically connected together and it may be logical separation using VLAN separation or other sorts of things like that to separate out the different layers of traffic. We need to be able to correlate everything together to work out where something's happened and enrich it. And those different sources of data might be Active Directory, as I've mentioned, or Enter ID. If we can go beyond the scene, then we can use orchestration and automated response to start to do some of that enrichment, as well as some other activities too. So what sorts of things can we do there? Well, if we've got our SIEM, say Splunk Enterprise Security, and we're using something like Splunk SOAR or another orchestration and automated response tool, then we can use that to look up context and enrichment at different points across the whole estate. We can maybe look at what's happening in Active Directory. Are we seeing user escalations? Are we seeing unexpected logins at the same time as we then see somebody trying to do lateral movement to be able to move towards the target and move towards a control server? Can we work out where something came in from? Have we seen any changes anywhere? Quite often, change is a really good indicator of some form of compromise. If we move beyond that sort of thinking about collecting our signal from everywhere and deploying orchestration and automated response on the side of it, then what we start to think about is enriching, contextualizing, and responding. If we can enrich from those different data sources, route through SOAR, then we can put context on things too. Then we can start to push out from there to inform. The response in an OT environment is probably, for me, even more sensitive than the response that we might have in an IT environment. In an OT environment, we're making physical changes to things that operate in real space. If we have an automated response to firewall rules, then maybe the worst thing that can happen in the IT estate is that we deny access to a segment of the network, or we deny access to our web servers for a period of time. We can probably solve that with an IT response. Sometimes the IT response is pretty drastic, and we might have to physically access the servers to do something with it. If we do that same sort of automated response in the OT space without careful consideration of what the impact can be, the impact's can be much, much more significant. We don't want to turn off pressure valves when pressure is building up because we've got a poorly considered plan, for example. We don't have to respond from our security events to control the physical events that are happening in the operational technology. Instead, what we can do in our automated response is think about accelerating some of our other standard business metrics, like mean time to detect, mean time to respond. How do we make people available and get their attention to be able to respond to the critical incident? And that's where SOAR can become really, really useful, because that allows us to drag all of the enrichment together in context and push it out to people, whether that might be a support analyst, somebody with OT responsibility, change management, incident management, etc., within the organization, and make them aware more consistently. That can bring some of the benefits that Floris mentioned earlier about MTTD and MTTR with some of the customers that Floris has been working with. That can make that more standardized and repeatable. So then we can reduce that exposure time, reduce the downtime or intercept time on anything that's happening, and bring it back round to allow somebody to operate on it sooner, to bring it back into service. I'm going to stop there though, and I'm going to ask Ewald, what does OT security mean to you in that wider context?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And I think now it's the time to highlight how to build resilience in OT security. I think this is an important point. And just to start with some bad news, manufacturing is actually the #1 targeted industry globally, and this already 4 years in a row. And the brutal truth, why is this the case? It's because it's pretty easy to hack manufacturing companies, because most companies, they have not modernized their security environment. And as Floris highlighted, it's mostly a money-making scheme of cyber criminals. And so there's clearly a gap in knowledge how to build the security, build resilience for OT security. And this is also clearly reflected in the OT security searches. So I just put up this chart last week, and you can see here the Google searches for OT security. They're at an all-time high since 2018. So very clearly, this is a top of mind in the OT world, how to build resilience with OT security. So there's also some nudge going on from the regulators. I'm talking here about NIS2, which also Floris highlighted. So this legislation is already in start since last year, October. Of course, there's some country-specific implementation going on. And for example, in Germany, this will be the case, I believe, end of this year or early next year. But basically what it means, that the companies have to report incidents rather quickly, so within 24 hours, and a more detailed report later. But maybe most importantly, it means a personal liability of the management. So the CISOs, they have to basically pay damages from their own pockets if a cyber attack happens and they have not modernized the security environment. So of course, if you go to this NIS2 regulations, of course, it's many pages and many regulations. But in the gist, to sum it up, it basically needs unified visibility across IT and OT environments. So you can clearly see here that IT and OT environments are clearly connected, say even when we speak about OT security. So IT and OT security very much clearly connected. So in this context, please let me highlight now two best practices. So first of all, IT and OT SOC, so an integrated SOC, so visibility across IT and OT, and why this is so important. So please let me highlight this at the so-called Purdo model. I think Floris explained this very well before. So in most cases, an attack happens from the IT side, from the office zone, typically via, let's say, a classic phishing email. You have won a big trip to the Bahamas, and the employee clicks on this email, and then the virus moves laterally. You can say it eats through the zones until it reaches the crown jewels in the productions, which are typically the control systems, where it leads, let's say, to a shutdown or to a damage or causes some other kind of trouble. And the problem is that this lateral movement is very, very slow. It can take a few months, maybe even up to half a year. So the attackers are very, very patient. And because this movement is very slow, it's very, very hard to detect. And as such, it's really important to have this visibility across all the zones. However, the reality is that many companies, I would say more or less all companies, have a classic IT SIEM. Some have also maybe also some specialized OT security vendors in place, like Nozomi or Clarity or Cybervision from Cisco. There are many, many players in this field, which is, of course, is fine, yeah. But these two silos are not interconnected, so there's no 100% centralized visibility across all these zones. So this leads, of course, to the so-called confusion matrix, the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. And of course, let's say the box, the bottom right, is the worst spot to be in, meaning that worse than being hacked is not knowing that you have been hacked. And this is actually the highest risk to your environment. And if you look at a very recent case, the Jaguar Land Rover case, if you read what's written in the news, the virus has been basically in their environment a few months before actually the attack happened. So a classic case of this unknown unknowns. The second best practice I would like to highlight is how to tackle the extremely high number of false alerts in OT environments. And we are hearing from our customers that they're experiencing 2,000, sometimes even 10,000 false alerts per day. And obviously, this is humanly not possible to deal with such amount of false alerts every day. I mean, of course, it leads to burnouts and missing of key notables. And of course, the solution is here to tackle these false alerts in a smart way, a solution so-called the risk-based alerting. You basically allocate to every event a so-called risk score, and the accumulation of risk scores leads to a so-called threshold, which can be defined by you. And once this threshold is crossed, only then you get an alert. Yeah, so a very elegant way to filter this extremely high number of false alerts. So how does now Splunk come into the picture here? How does the Splunk add value? And now I would like to use the analogy of the so-called earthquake-proof towers in Japan. They bend, but they don't break in the case of an earthquake. And actually, it's very similar with cyber attacks. It's not a question of yes or no. An cyber attack will eventually hit all kinds of companies, no matter how big or small they are. And of course, in this case, the organization may bend, but of course should not break when the cyber attack happens. So how does this now work? So how now to build a so-called earthquake-proof or cyber attack-proof tower? So it's basically a step-by-step approach. You're using a certain kind of bricks. And of course, let's say the foundational brick is the highlighted unified view across IT and OT environments. This is very, very important to actually catch the virus. The second important brick is here an integrated IT-OT SOC, so not to have a separate SOCs. Yeah? Then, of course, it's very important to build OT-specific use cases, and the classic during the COVID time was remote access to all the factories. Then, of course, a perimeter monitoring is very important, and there was a question from the audience how to deal, let's say, with air-gapped kind of environments. And the clear answer is here, air-gapped environments are not safe, yeah. And if you use this perimeter monitoring, you can clearly show that there's also traffic in the factory where there's actually no traffic supposed to be, yeah. And this clearly shows that nobody should really rely on air-gapping. It's not safe, yeah. Then, of course, an important brick is the so-called ICS MITRE ATT&CK rules. And the MITRE ATT&CK rules, so this framework exists since many, many years for IT security. And since about 2 or 3 years, this was also implemented for OT security, so for industrial control systems. So it's very, very important to make this basically a component of your OT security strategy. And the icing of the cake of this tower is, of course, orchestration automation, the risk-based alerting, as I mentioned before, and for some companies, a cloud-based SIEM. So what does this mean now in terms of products? So from Splunk, on the one hand side, we have our market-leading product called the Splunk Enterprise Security ES, and this is complemented by a Splunk so-called OT security add-on. Yeah? And the good news is that this Splunk OT security add-on is basically free for all Splunk Enterprise Security customers. So it's basically an app downloadable from our so-called Splunk base. This is basically the app store of Splunk. You can see here a link on the slide here. So Splunk Enterprise Security plus the Splunk OT security add-on. Forrester highlighted actually that Cisco and Splunk is a leader in the OT security space, and you see many companies on this chart here. And the truth is here that most of these companies on this chart, they are not competitors of us. They're actually data sources. Yeah? So we just implement them as a data source to complement this unified view. So how does this look like? So if you look again at the Purdue model, on the left-hand side, the Office Zone, you have the traditional IT SIEM. On the right-hand side, you have the OT security players. So now with the Splunk OT security add-on, we're diving now deeper down the Purdue model. So much more than a classic enterprise SIEM. We're diving now deeper up to level 2. And our friends from the right-hand side, Clarity, Cybervision, Nozomi, Dragos, and so on, we simply ingest them as a data source. Yeah? And as a result, we can provide this holistic visibility from level 0 to 5, yeah? Which is very, very important, as I highlighted before. So to sum up, what are the 3 key main benefits of IT/OT security with Splunk? Number 1, clearly, I think I mentioned it many times, this holistic visibility across IT and OT environments. And it doesn't matter if it's on-premise, hybrid, or as a cloud. And of course, most importantly, it should be via a central integrated IT/OT stock. And then secondly, the dedicated OT environments coverage via implementation also of the ICS MITRE ATT&CK rules, and of course also the integration of all the OT security ecosystem, all the individualized vendors. And thirdly, this is becoming, I would say, more and more important security automation and orchestration technologies, very much driven by AI, for example, risk-based alerting, also orchestration, automation, and response, and a tool which is called the attack analyzer, yeah, which of course makes the life of a security analyst much easier. And of course, also in terms, let's say, of market realities for some companies, it's very hard to find expensive security talent on the market, and this kind of automation and orchestration technologies makes life much easier for companies. So what is now needed to get up to speed? Floris, what do you think?
Thanks, Ewald. Yes, good question. This all sounds really exciting, but maybe also a lot to chew off. So what would be really helpful is if we had some sort of guide on how to get started with this. And I think I posted it over already at the beginning. This is what we did at that specific oil trading company. One should start by establishing criticality. So this is common procedure when we also look at IT. Maybe we use different words. We are saying, okay, what are your crown jewels? What is your reason for being? But at the end of the day, we want to know what are your core processes and how much does it hurt if they are no longer working, and how fast does it hurt? And that will allow you to make a number of buckets. And you might make 3 buckets like I have here, or you might make 7 or 9. But at some point, what would be really helpful is to make that triage and just see, okay, this part might be the most important, so probably I have to fix that first. That exercise is where it all starts. Then subsequently, once that's identified, we can check, okay, do we then also have all the preconditions in place? Is the physical security guaranteed? Do we have a defensible architecture? And when we do want to start detecting, how does it all interconnect? What's already in place? Do we have network monitoring? Because again, network monitoring is where it really starts in OT, because network monitoring allows you to do that passive listening and doesn't have any disruptive capability like installing agents, for example, would. But probably there are also already firewalls in place and maybe other sources of logs. So we can already make use of those and ingest them into SIEM, like Splunk Enterprise Security. Maybe you can even do something with endpoint detection tools, even though I previously said, oh, you probably shouldn't install agents. But there are some machines, maybe at the top layers of the purging model in OT at layer 3, that do run normal Windows, do run normal Linux. And there you might be able to use endpoint tools that you can then subsequently ingest into your SIEM. So what this boils down to is look at what you already have. There's no need to start investing in all kinds of new tools, but make sure that you have a view on your network, that's visible, and that you don't leave any capabilities that you already have unused. Then there's a question on, okay, who then should start looking at the output of those tools? Is that going to be your internal SOC? Do you need 24/7 monitoring? Is it internal or external monitoring? Do you need a managed SOC capability? And as NCC Group, we do provide that managed SOC capability, so we have quite a bit of experience there. And the key point is, as Ewald said, is to make sure that you do not inundate your SOC analyst with thousands of alerts, but make sure that you only find those that are actually the most important. And that's where a lot of technical solutions are really handy, like Splunk Enterprise Security and all the built-in features of that. But it also takes some understanding of what you're looking at. What parts can we filter out? What parts do we not want to filter out because they're way too important if we get it wrong? And that filtering and tuning process is something that we would then also do for our clients. And at long last, if you have that high-level plan, and if you decided this is where I want to start, then the actual implementation starts to happen. You can build a priority order, and as NCC Group, we oftentimes help our clients with building out a priority order to lay out a multi-stage plan to get to that level of security, to get to that level of NIST2 compliance, for example, that you aim to achieve. And then at some point we start operationalizing those. Subsequently, I think Ewald already articulated this much better than I could, but there is the big question on how we're going to correlate the IT events and the OT signals. And we do think this is super important to get right. And the era where we could say, oh, you need to do IT monitoring and oh, maybe you also need to do OT monitoring separately. I think that's completely over, because again, most incidents that are happening in OT, things that are actually of concern there, are really originating in IT. So you want to have that full visibility, and you want to make sure that you see what's coming from the outside in. And it's a bit like if you're thinking about the security of your own home, for example. What's best, to have cameras only on the inside of your house, or also cameras on the outside of your house, and maybe even check what's happening right on your doorstep? And that's effectively what you're doing here. You're looking at what's coming in from IT, you look at what's happening in the back, in OT, and you're making sure that you have visibility on what's happening in between. So this is essentially what happens once you start operationalizing how that works. So we figured out, okay, we want network sensors. We would then need to make sure that we deploy them in the network. And once they're deployed, once they're on site, we can start the baselining periods and see, okay, what's normal operation? How does the deviation that potentially look like? What's not normal? Maybe even create some custom detection rules specifically for a client, because they might have an exotic setup, or they might have a protocol that's unique to them, and build out those rules, see how we can then subsequently correlate. In Splunk, we can quite easily correlate the alerts coming out of the network sensor with alerts coming out of the firewall, with alerts coming out of your EDR system, with alerts coming from other log sources, maybe even with IOCs from a public threat intel feed, and then build out a single cohesive case or incident, which can be triaged by the SOC analyst, who would then do their normal job, which is, okay, is this specific case a true or false positive? In case it's a true positive, take action, and that action could be just informing the end customer, just informing you, but it could also be to take actual action, potentially by the use of Splunk SOAR, as Jamie already mentioned. And I'd like to wrap up by saying, what does this all mean? And that's, as always, the main question in life. But in this case, it means that this provides you a sort of high-level tooling, some ingredients to start with on how to avoid security incidents, how to avoid fines, because they can actually be quite substantial, and they can actually be given for not being in control of your OT environment. And the most important thing, to avoid security incidents where you might need to shut down. And if we look at that client way from the beginning of the presentation, that might save you a lot more money than just a 300K fine, because the consequences can really be quite large. So what we would like to leave you with before we move on to the questions right at the end is a summary at the end. These are the practical next steps, as well as a link to Splunk Lantern, which is the customer success center that Splunk offers, and that allows you some practical things to get started with as well. So be sure to check it out. And we've also listed the link to a blog. This might be a really good time to pause for questions. There were a few in the chat. Let me just take a quick look. I think this one was already partially addressed by Ewald, but we might voice it anyway. So the question is, how does your solution work in air-gapped environments, or when the protocols are encrypted? I think Ewald already mentioned that air-gapped oftentimes is an illusion. And when you when you look at perimeter monitoring, you will find out that the air-gapped segment might not be as air-gapped as you expected. But let's exercise the idea, the thought experiment of that it's actually air-gapped. That does introduce some problems with monitoring, especially when you would like to have it monitored by an offsite SOC. It doesn't mean that you're completely out of options. You might still want to know what's happening inside the air gap, and you can still employ a sensor. So at least NCC Group sensors, they can work completely in a completely air-gapped environment, but then you also need to make sure that you evaluate the output inside that air-gapped environment, otherwise you would break the air gap, which might be possible if you have the resources to look at that. Another possibility would be to break the air gap, but only break the air gap one way. For example, by permitting traffic going from the inside, from the OT environment to the outside. And you could potentially do that with a data diode, which is a lot stronger than just building out firewall rules. Or even more exotic by building a two-way data diode and only making sure that certain traffic can come in and certain traffic can come out. So there are definitely possibilities if you have such an environment. And when we look at encryption, the secondary part of the question, encryption is quite a bit rarer in OT compared to IT, but it definitely does exist. For example, I previously talked about S7COM, the Siemens protocol, but there also is S7COM Plus now, which is the encrypted variant. That doesn't necessarily mean that we can't monitor at all or do anything with that, because you can still see patterns in traffic, and you can still inspect parts of the PCAP that are maybe not encrypted, like headers. And like in IT, we do create detection rules based on that. So there are possibilities, is the short answer to the question. Anything to add to that, Jamie or Ewald?
Yeah, I was just going to say on those air-gapped networks as well, you were saying about the network sensors. If we're truly air-gapped, and it has to be contained and inside that air-gapped network, and we can't punch out, then the network sensors, but also Splunk and SOAR, two of the bits that we've talked about here as well, they can be hosted on-prem in devices that are inside that air-gapped network too. So you still get the benefit of that analysis and detection too, including of any of the ancillary IT estate that might be inside that air-gapped network segment too, for any control servers or any other bits and pieces that might be there, printers and things too that we can get data from.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Just looking at the questions in the chat. We do have some other questions. For example, what are the most important data sources for OT security? Is that one that you wanted to take, Jamie?
I can take it. So, I mean, if you look at, let's say, starting with OT security, obviously a lot of different data sources, and I would say it makes sense to categorize them in, let's say, must-have data sources and nice-to-have data sources for a later stage. And answering the question directly, so the most important data source is by all means the firewall data. Yeah. So starting with firewall data, this is the most important data source for OT security.
I think on those other bits that you've talked about there as well, Ewald and Floris, through the session, then talking about where we can contextualize and enrich as well. So where does that firewall live? Which buildings is it in? What services does it serve as well? That's where the enrichment comes in as well, and becomes a really useful secondary data source beyond, to give you context, right? Data becomes information by putting it in context, and that becomes absolutely key, I think. Just to extend what Ewald had said there as well.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Another question is, what are your thoughts on combining IT and OT traffic on the same sensor? I'll take that one first. Well, this is something that the answer is, as always, it depends, right? It depends on where the sensor is, what the network architecture is, and what the capacity of that given sensor is. With our network sensors, it's theoretically possible. That doesn't necessarily always mean it's a great idea. Either because it's more simple and more economical oftentimes to get a second sensor than to reroute your complete network. But also because it might require a separate Suicata instance, for example, running on a separate Docker on the same sensor, or because you might easily run out of space, disk space or bandwidth space. So there are quite a few considerations, and it's definitely possible. It also doesn't need to be a security issue, even though you're combining IT and OT traffic. It's essentially one-way traffic that you're gathering through passive monitoring, so that's not necessarily the issue. But yes, from my perspective, the answer is it depends, and this is where we would start looking with a solution architect at your specific architecture. Anything to add to that, Team Splunk?
You summarized it nicely, Floris. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think we kind of already tackled this last one that I see here, but it's what is the role of data diodes in OT? I previously mentioned them as a way to sort of mitigate some of the risks to handle the air gap. Maybe to to add to that is that the data diode doesn't then need to be capable of working with OT protocols. Not all of them are, but the proxy that you would use for data diode needs to be compatible with Modbus, with Profinet, BACnet, whatever OT protocol. So that might be a thing to look out for and ask your vendor about, essentially.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other bit there is that the data diode gives you that absolute certainty of beyond what you can do with the network sensor, that control traffic can't leak back through that collection plane, that you're not accidentally putting any kind of control packets and payloads into the network infrastructure where the signal is coming from as well, because you've got that isolation, right?
Absolutely. So this is the final question that's suitable to me. Are there any finishing remarks from Team Splunk, perhaps?
I think the data shows it very clearly. I think it's a high time for companies to modernize their security environment, and especially there's a urgent need to modernize, especially the OT part. So OT security, I would say, is clearly a top of mind of the OT world these days.
Yes, we agree, and we see it happening in the market a lot more often as well. Not necessarily only the threats occurring, but also the ask for help with the OT security posture, whether it's from a consulting perspective, whether it's from an implementation perspective, or we get asked to maybe set up the monitoring infrastructure or even the prevention infrastructure. But we also see asked for incident response coverage to make sure that we cover the OT estate from an incident response perspective, and now increasingly from a managed service perspective as well. And that's really something of the past 2-3 years, where we see RFPs coming in, RFIs coming in, asking about OT monitoring for good reasons. So I'm quite happy that organizations are realizing that this is a serious subject, and that regulators are realizing that. And of course, I'm also quite happy that we are able to help them a little bit with that. And on that sort of high note, I would like to conclude the webinar. It's exactly 5 o'clock where I'm at, 4 o'clock in the UK. Thank you everyone for attending, or everyone that's watching this back. Thank you so much, Jamie and Ewald, for participating in this webinar and allowing us a view on what Splunk can offer. And have a great evening and a great weekend later on.
Thank you. Bye.